the new god of protection, the new gods of protection, the new god of protection, the new goddess of protection, the new goddesses of protection, the new goddess of protection, the old god of protection, the old gods of protection, the old god of protection, the old goddess of protection, the old goddesses of protection, the old goddess of protection, the greater god of protection, the greater gods of protection, the greater god of protection, the greater goddess of protection, the greater goddesses of protection, the greater goddess of protection, the lesser god of protection, the lesser gods of protection, the lesser god of protection, the lesser goddess of protection, the lesser goddesses of protection, the lesser goddess of protection, the higher god of protection, the higher gods of protection, the higher god of protection, the higher goddess of protection, the higher goddesses of protection, the higher goddess of protection, the lower god of protection, the lower gods of protection, the lower god of protection, the lower goddess of protection, the lower goddesses of protection, the lower goddess of protection, the greater spirit of protection, the greater spirits of protection, the greater spirit of protection, the lesser spirit of protection, the lesser spirits of protection, the lesser spirit of protection, the higher spirit of protection, the higher spirits of protection, the higher spirit of protection, the lower spirit of protection, the lower spirits of protection, the lower spirit of protection, the major god of protection, the major gods of protection, the major god of protection, the major goddess of protection, the major goddesses of protection, the major goddess of protection, the minor god of protection, the minor gods of protection, the minor god of protection, the minor goddess of protection, the minor goddesses of protection, the minor goddess of protection, the superior god of protection, the superior gods of protection, the superior god of protection, the superior goddess of protection, the superior goddesses of protection, the superior goddess of protection, the inferior god of protection, the inferior gods of protection, the inferior god of protection, the inferior goddess of protection, the inferior goddesses of protection, the inferior goddess of protection, the ancestor god of protection, the ancestor gods of protection, the ancestor god of protection, the ancestor goddess of protection, the ancestor goddesses of protection, the ancestor goddess of protection, the ascendant god of protection, the ascendant gods of protection, the ascendant god of protection, the ascendant goddess of protection, the ascendant goddesses of protection, the ascendant goddess of protection, the descendant god of protection, the descendant gods of protection, the descendant god of protection, the descendant goddess of protection, the descendant goddesses of protection, the descendant goddess of protection, the transcendent god of protection, the transcendent gods of protection, the transcendent god of protection, the transcendent goddess of protection, the transcendent goddesses of protection, the transcendent goddess of protection, the past god of protection, the past gods of protection, the past god of protection, the past goddess of protection, the past goddesses of protection, the past goddess of protection, the present god of protection, the present gods of protection, the present god of protection, the present goddess of protection, the present goddesses of protection, the present goddess of protection, the future god of protection, the future gods of protection, the future god of protection, the future goddess of protection, the future goddesses of protection, the future goddess of protection, the authentic god of protection, the authentic gods of protection, the authentic god of protection, the authentic goddess of protection, the authentic goddesses of protection, the authentic goddess of protection, the synthetic god of protection, the synthetic gods of protection, the synthetic god of protection, the synthetic goddess of protection, the synthetic goddesses of protection, the synthetic goddess of protection, the progressive god of protection, the progressive gods of protection, the progressive god of protection, the progressive goddess of protection, the progressive goddesses of protection, the progressive goddess of protection, the regressive god of protection, the regressive gods of protection, the regressive god of protection, the regressive goddess of protection, The regressive goddesses of protection. The regressive goddess of protection. The ordinary god of protection. The ordinary gods of protection. The ordinary god of protection. The ordinary goddess of protection. The ordinary goddesses of protection. The ordinary goddess of protection. The extraordinary god of protection. The extraordinary gods of protection. The extraordinary god of protection. The extraordinary goddess of protection. The extraordinary goddesses of protection. The extraordinary goddess of protection. The static god of protection. The static gods of protection. The static god of protection. The static goddess of protection. The static goddesses of protection. The static goddess of protection. The dynamic god of protection. The dynamic gods of protection. The dynamic god of protection. The dynamic goddess of protection. The dynamic goddesses of protection. The dynamic goddess of protection. The land god of protection. The land gods of protection. The land god of protection. The land goddess of protection. The land goddesses of protection. The land goddess of protection. The sea god of protection. The sea gods of protection. The sea god of protection. The sea goddess of protection. The sea goddesses of protection. The sea goddess of protection. The sky god of protection. The sky gods of protection. The sky god of protection. The sky goddess of protection. The sky goddesses of protection. The sky goddess of protection. The god of protection. The gods of protection. The god of protection. The goddess of protection. The goddesses of protection. The goddess of protection. The half god of protection. The half gods of protection. The half god of protection. The half goddess of protection. The half goddesses of protection. The half goddess of protection. The vessel of protection. The vessels of protection. The vessel of protection. The name of protection. The names of protection. The name of protection. The person of protection. The persons of protection. The person of protection. The persona of protection. The personas of protection. The persona of protection. The personage of protection. The personages of protection. The personage of protection. The personality of protection. The personalities of protection. The personality of protection. The personification of protection. The personifications of protection. The personification of protection. The image of protection. The images of protection. The image of protection. The imagination of protection. The imaginations of protection. The imagination of protection. The belief of protection. The beliefs of protection. The belief of protection. The thought of protection. The thoughts of protection. The thought of protection. The word of protection. The words of protection. The word of protection. The action of protection. The actions of protection. The action of protection. The reaction of protection. The reactions of protection. The reaction of protection. The feeling of protection. The feelings of protection. The feeling of protection. The situation of protection. The situations of protection. The situation of protection. The circumstance of protection. The circumstances of protection. The circumstance of protection. The environment of protection. The environments of protection. The environment of protection. The relationship of protection. The relationships of protection. The relationship of protection. The number of protection. The numbers of protection. The number of protection. The formula of protection. The formulas of protection. The formula of protection. The equation of protection. The equations of protection. The equation of protection. The theory of protection. The theories of protection. The theory of protection. The symbol of protection. The symbols of protection. The symbol of protection. The color of protection. The colors of protection. The color of protection. The thing of protection. The things of protection. The thing of protection. The way of protection. The ways of protection. The way of protection. The place of protection. The places of protection. The place of protection. The time of protection. The times of protection. The time of protection. The event of protection. The events of protection. The event of protection. The result of protection. The results of protection. The result of protection. The crown of protection. The crowns of protection. The crown of protection. The throne of protection. The thrones of protection. The throne of protection. The protection king. The protection kings. The protection kingdom. The protection kingdoms. The protection king's subject. The protection king's subjects. The protection king's dominion. The protection king's dominions. The kingdom of protection. The kingdoms of protection. The kingdom of protection. The protection queen. The protection queens. The protection queendom. The protection queendoms. The protection queen's subject. The protection queen's subjects. The protection queen's dominion. The protection queen's dominions. The queendom of protection. The queendoms of protection. The queendom of protection. The protection prince. The protection princes. The protection princedom. The protection princedoms. The protection prince's subject. The protection prince's subjects. The protection prince's dominion. The protection prince's dominions. The princedom of protection. The princedoms of protection. The princedom of protection. The protection princess. The protection princesses. The protection princessdom. The protection princessdoms. The protection princess's subject. The protection princess's subjects. The protection princess's dominion. The protection princess's dominions. The princessdom of protection. The princessdoms of protection. The princessdom of protection. The lord of protection. The lords of protection. The lord of protection. The lordess of protection. The lordesses of protection. The lordess of protection. The priest of protection. The priests of protection. The priest of protection. The priestess of protection. The priestesses of protection. The priestess of protection. The ritual of protection. The rituals of protection. The ritual of protection. The shrine of protection. The shrines of protection. The shrine of protection. The temple of protection. The temples of protection. The temple of protection. The leader of protection. The leaders of protection. The leader of protection. The follower of protection. The followers of protection. The follower of protection. The natural substance of protection. The natural substances of protection. The natural substance of protection. The supernatural substance of protection. The supernatural substances of protection. The supernatural substance of protection. The temporal substance of protection. The temporal substances of protection. The temporal substance of protection. The spiritual substance of protection. The spiritual substances of protection. The spiritual substance of protection. The natural form of protection. The natural forms of protection. The natural form of protection. The supernatural form of protection. The supernatural forms of protection. The supernatural form of protection. The temporal form of protection. The temporal forms of protection. The temporal form of protection. The spiritual form of protection. The spiritual forms of protection. The spiritual form of protection. The age of protection. The ages of protection. The age of protection. The era of protection. The eras of protection. The era of protection. The awakener of protection. The awakeners of protection. The awakener of protection. The awakening of protection. The awakenings of protection. The awakening of protection. The realm of protection. The realms of protection. The realm of protection. The dimension of protection. The dimensions of protection. The dimension of protection. The zone of protection. The zones of protection. The zone of protection. The frequency of protection. The frequencies of protection. The frequency of protection. The century of protection. The centuries of protection. The century of protection. The millennium of protection. The millenniums of protection. The millennium of protection. The purpose of protection. The purposes of protection. The purpose of protection. The meaning of protection. The meanings of protection. The meaning of protection. The culture of protection. The cultures of protection. The culture of protection. The demonstrator of protection. The demonstrators of protection. The demonstrator of protection. The demonstration of protection. The demonstrations of protection. The demonstration of protection. The manifester of protection. The manifestors of protection. The manifester of protection. The manifestation of protection. The manifestations of protection. The manifestation of protection. The presence of protection. The presences of protection. The presence of protection. The glow of protection. The glows of protection. The glow of protection. The goal of protection. The goals of protection. The goal of protection. The plan of protection. The plans of protection. The plan of protection. The book of protection. The books of protection. The book of protection. The philosopher of protection. The philosophers of protection. The philosopher of protection. The philosophy of protection. The philosophies of protection. The philosophy of protection. The releaser of protection. The releasers of protection. The releaser of protection. The release of protection. The releases of protection. The release of protection. The variable of protection. The variables of protection. The variable of protection. The cause of protection. The causes of protection. The cause of protection. The effect of protection. The effects of protection. The effect of protection. The journey of protection. The journeys of protection. The journey of protection. The emergence of protection. The emergences of protection. The emergence of protection. The source of protection. The sources of protection. The source of protection. The originator of protection. The originators of protection. The originator of protection. The origin of protection. The origins of protection. The origin of protection. The forefather of protection. The forefathers of protection. The forefather of protection. The foremother of protection. The foremothers of protection. The foremother of protection. The ancestor of protection. The ancestors of protection. The ancestor of protection. The descendant of protection. The descendants of protection. The descendant of protection. The lineage of protection. The lineages of protection. The lineage of protection. The heritage of protection. The heritages of protection. The heritage of protection. The heir of protection. The heirs of protection. The heir of protection. The co-heir of protection. The co-heirs of protection. The co-heir of protection. The joint heir of protection. The joint heirs of protection. The joint heir of protection. The dynasty of protection. The dynasties of protection. The dynasty of protection. The force of protection. The forces of protection. The force of protection. The law of protection. The laws of protection. The law of protection. The pact of protection. The pacts of protection. The pact of protection. The game of protection. The games of protection. The game of protection. The mask of protection. The masks of protection. The mask of protection. The armor of protection. The armors of protection. The armor of protection. The sword of protection. The swords of protection. The sword of protection. The shield of protection. The shields of protection. The shield of protection. The force shield of protection. The force shields of protection. The force shield of protection. The armored force shield of protection. The armored force shields of protection. The armored force shield of protection. The champion of protection. The champions of protection. The champion of protection. The guardian of protection. The guardians of protection. The guardian of protection. The defender of protection. The defenders of protection. The defender of protection. The protector of protection. The protectors of protection. The protector of protection. The chant of protection. The chants of protection. The chant of protection. The shape of protection. The shapes of protection. The shape of protection. The cube of protection. The cubes of protection. The cube of protection. The cuboid of protection. The cuboids of protection. The cuboid of protection. The sphere of protection. The spheres of protection. The sphere of protection. The spheroid of protection. The spheroids of protection. The spheroid of protection. The prism of protection. The prisms of protection. The prism of protection. The pyramid of protection. The pyramids of protection. The pyramid of protection. The cylinder of protection. The cylinders of protection. The cylinder of protection. The cone of protection. The cones of protection. The cone of protection. The triangle of protection. The triangles of protection. The triangle of protection. The circle of protection. The circles of protection. The circle of protection. The semicircle of protection. The semicircles of protection. the semicircle of protection, the square of protection, the squares of protection, the square of protection, the rectangle of protection, the rectangles of protection, the rectangle of protection, the parallelogram of protection, the parallelograms of protection, the parallelogram of protection, the rhombus of protection, the rhombuses of protection, the rhombus of protection, the trapezoid of protection, the trapezoids of protection, the trapezoid of protection, the polygon of protection, the polygons of protection, the polygon of protection, the pentagon of protection, the pentagons of protection, the pentagon of protection, the hexagon of protection, the hexagons of protection, the hexagon of protection, the septagon of protection, the septagons of protection, the septagon of protection, the octagon of protection, the octagons of protection, the octagon of protection, the nonagon of protection, the nonagons of protection, the nonagon of protection, the decagon of protection, the decagons of protection, the decagon of protection, the evolution of protection, the evolutions of protection, the evolution of protection, the revolution of protection, the revolutions of protection, the revolution of protection, the elemental art of protection, the elemental arts of protection, the elemental art of protection, the elemental science of protection, the elemental sciences of protection, the elemental science of protection, the elemental principle of protection, the elemental principles of protection, the elemental principle of protection, the elemental technology of protection, the elemental technologies of protection, the elemental technology of protection, the low elemental art of protection, the low elemental arts of protection, the low elemental art of protection, the low elemental science of protection, the low elemental sciences of protection, the low elemental science of protection, the low elemental principle of protection, the low elemental principles of protection, the low elemental principle of protection, the low elemental technology of protection, the low elemental technologies of protection, the low elemental technology of protection, the high elemental art of protection, the high elemental arts of protection, the high elemental art of protection, the high elemental science of protection, the high elemental sciences of protection, the high elemental science of protection, the high elemental principle of protection, the high elemental principles of protection, the high elemental principle of protection, the high elemental technology of protection, the high elemental technologies of protection, the high elemental technology of protection, the agent of protection, the agents of protection, the agent of protection, the agency of protection, the agencies of protection, the agency of protection, the amplifier of protection, the amplifiers of protection, the amplifier of protection, the amplification of protection, the amplifications of protection, the amplification of protection, the enhancer of protection, the enhancers of protection, the enhancer of protection, the enhancement of protection, the enhancements of protection, the enhancement of protection, the magnifier of protection, the magnifiers of protection, the magnifier of protection, the magnification of protection, the magnifications of protection, the magnification of protection, the influencer of protection, the influencers of protection, the influencer of protection, the influence of protection, the influences of protection, the influence of protection, the emanator of protection, the emanators of protection, the emanator of protection, the emanation of protection, the emanations of protection, the emanation of protection, the converger of protection, the convergers of protection, the converger of protection, the convergence of protection, the convergences of protection, the convergence of protection, the aura of protection, the auras of protection, the aura of protection, the impression of protection, the impressions of protection, the impression of protection, the intelligence of protection, the intelligences of protection, the intelligence of protection, the sophistication of protection, the sophistications of protection, the sophistication of protection, the genius of protection, the geniuses of protection, the genius of protection, the polymath of protection, the polymaths of protection, the polymath of protection, the psychic of protection, the psychics of protection, the psychic of protection, the knowledge of protection, the knowledges of protection, the knowledge of protection, the understanding of protection, the understandings of protection, the understanding of protection, the wisdom of protection, the wisdoms of protection, the wisdom of protection, the secret of protection, the secrets of protection, the secret of protection, the mystery of protection, the mysteries of protection, the mystery of protection, the revelation of protection, the revelations of protection, the revelation of protection, the tactic of protection, the tactics of protection, the tactic of protection, the strategy of protection, the strategies of protection, the strategy of protection, the strength of protection, the strengths of protection, the strength of protection, the might of protection, the mights of protection, the might of protection, the power of protection, the powers of protection, the power of protection, the authority of protection, the authorities of protection, the authority of protection, the dominion of protection, the dominions of protection, the dominion of protection, the rhythm of protection, the rhythms of protection, the rhythm of protection, the melody of protection, the melodies of protection, the melody of protection, the music of protection, the musics of protection, the music of protection, the lyric of protection, the lyrics of protection, the lyric of protection, the song of protection, the songs of protection, the song of protection, the dance of protection, the dances of protection, the dance of protection, the spirit of protection, the spirits of protection, the spirit of protection, the soul of protection, the souls of protection, the soul of protection, the body of protection, the bodies of protection, the body of protection, the mark of protection, the marks of protection, the mark of protection, the promise of protection, the promises of protection, the promise of protection, the visionary of protection, the visionaries of protection, the visionary of protection, the vision of protection, the visions of protection, the vision of protection, the picture of protection, the pictures of protection, the picture of protection, the sound of protection, the sounds of protection, the sound of protection, the dung of protection, the dungs of protection, the dung of protection, the language of protection, the languages of protection, the language of protection, the communication of protection, the communications of protection, the communication of protection, the people of protection, the peoples of protection, the people of protection, the society of protection, the societies of protection, the society of protection, the fortress of protection, the fortresses of protection, the fortress of protection, the government of protection, the governments of protection, the government of protection, the city of protection, the cities of protection, the city of protection, the nation of protection, the nations of protection, the nation of protection, the civilization of protection, the civilizations of protection, the civilization of protection, the world of protection, the worlds of protection, the world of protection,